Hey everyone, this is Katie from Moonflower Moments. I want to put myself in a little bit more of a vulnerable place by sharing with you how my tarot practice looks when things become too much and when things are uncertain. And I am going to be talking about some really tough emotions here. I think it's really important for us during changing times and during uncertain times to build community. And I really just want to reiterate here, even, though it's just the intro of my video, how blessed I am that the tarot community is one that pays attention and one that acts when they feel the call to do so. And so, though I'm not a mental health professional by any means, I did want to share with this community the kind of things that I'm doing to kind of keep my head on straight, even though times are rapidly changing really quickly, and a lot of us are feeling those hard feelings right now. So this is a continuation of my Tarot Mood Reader series. So if you like this kind of content, I'll leave a link in the description box below in order to give you easy access to the other two videos. But this is definitely the one where I think the emotions are going to come through the strongest and be the most heavy. So I am pulling from Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart, and in this book, Brené Brown, who is a psychologist, describes different emotional states that we experience in different circumstances. So in the case of this one, I am covering when things are too uncertain and when things are too much. And so I'm going to start with the way my tarot practice looks like when things are too much. So she describes the first emotion we feel when things are too much is essentially stress. So when we perceive that the demand and what is demanded of us is beyond our ability to cope successfully. And that's why we experience stress day to day. And that's why stress is considered to be one of the silent killers, because it is something that is experienced long term in little doses. And of course, that adds up. So when I'm feeling that the demand is well beyond my ability to cope, I tend to reach for oracles more than tarot. And so I've selected 3 different oracles to demonstrate kind of the severity of the response that I would have depending on the needs that I have. So this one is Queen of the Moon Oracle. This is Prairie, Majesty. And then this is the Secrets of the Mystic Grove. So I think that it's important to consider before we engage in tarot in general, how much of our spiritual energy we have to give, but also our emotional energy, right? Because everything is a currency. So if I'm under stress, but it's not too terribly extreme, I'm recognizing that I feel stressed, but I'm still able to engage with it and question it. I'm going to pull out a card like this, which is the Secrets of the Mystic Grove, that has 3 keywords, but also has a really excellent guidebook. So essentially, when I am able to, I do want to sit through that stress and I want to hold space for it. And I want to ask it, why are you here? What are you trying to teach me? What can I learn to better cope with this? And so I find that this is an excellent deck for that reason, because I have 3 different keywords that I can pull to kind of chew on. A lot of times when we're stressed, one of the first things that goes out of the window is our ability to think cognitively. So like I said, this is what I would use in a more low stress situation to try to help me navigate that in a way that is appropriate. Now, I do work with a guidebook pretty substantially for this one. So for example, for rewards, we have 3 cards right here. What can I celebrate right now? What are 3 things I'm grateful for today? And what rewards are there to be found in sharing? So while these are definitely more light wash questions, I do find that questions such as what am I grateful for, which is prompted by a deck such as this, helps remind me of the support system that I have in place to help navigate myself through that stress. And so I like playing with decks that remind me to be present and remind me to have that gratitude when I'm engaging with that level of stress. It also helps me too that this is a nature oracle. So in particular, I am able to tell, even if it's not written in the guidebook, most of these animals and most of these creatures that are listed So in the case of this card, the guidebook actually does reference the flamingo, but it doesn't reference this tiger moth, which is one of my spiritual symbols. And it also doesn't reference like this fritillary butterfly. But I see those animals, and like especially with the fritillary butterfly, which I have a gorgeous tattoo of, and like is always in my garden. I talk about it all the time in this space. It's a reminder that one of the best ways to de-stress for me is to engage with nature and to ground. And so I appreciate these nods that nature is all around me, and that is one of the ways that I can break through with it. So this is like when like I said, I'm kind of like lower stress, when I have more spoons to give per se. Now, if I'm experiencing a medium amount of stress, I can still play with the emotion. I can still sit with the emotion. I can still think about the emotion. And so in those cases, I use the Prairie Majesty. But you can see immediately that this deck differs from this one because this deck only has one keyword and it only has one question. And so while it gives me a foothold to explore the emotion that I'm experiencing and the conditions that I'm experiencing, the scope is much smaller, which can be really helpful when I'm beginning to feel incredibly overwhelmed. Unlike the words in this oracle, which say divide, separation, discord, these are kind of just general topics. This deck is instead written in a more affirmative sense. So the words are all verbs. So we have burn, swim, dabble, breathe. And so instead of kind of playing with concepts over here, this is where we get a little bit more direct instruction from the cards of how to deal with that level of stress. And I do find it to be incredibly useful to carry that one question with me throughout the day. What riches do I carry within? And that could be my focal point to help me get a grip on what is going on around me and really kind of acknowledge that like I do need work to do and I need to kind of dive into these triggers, but you know, I don't have to like deep dive like this. This is more like a light dive. Oh, and it's funny I said dive because it's there. So this is for Prairie Majesty. Now on my high stress days, when I'm really kind of on the edge between stress and overwhelm, I absolutely pull my Queen of the Moon Oracle. So in the case of this deck, I really don't like the guidebook very much, so I don't find myself reaching for it, which you could say is a negative, but in the case of when I'm stressed, that's actually a positive because I think that there is such a thing as information overload when you're stressed. I suffer a lot from like decision fatigue, and I find that when I'm really in the heavy doses of decision fatigue, when I'm stressed so much that I become overwhelmed, I don't want to play with like these larger guidebooks. Like I just kind of want to get my message and get my grip and get my feel for the situation and then carry up on my day. And so I think that this is a great deck for when you're experiencing sort of those low energy moments, but you still want to play with the cards. You still want some support helping to carry you out of that stress. But at the same time, you know, we might not have the time, we might not have the energy, because energy is a privilege, energy is a resource to sit down and question ourselves. Sometimes we need some sort of divine guidance that says to us directly, release. And these firm, action-oriented keywords are really the ones that help me to maintain the most when I'm close to spiraling. Like these decks too, Prairie Majesty, I did not mention it, but I love a great blue heron, so this is still nature focused, but this is also nature focused with the moon. And I think on like high stress days, the moon is a really beautiful reminder of like, yeah, maybe things are coming up for you, just like the moon kind of brings things up from underneath, but like the moon, you know, things are going to go away, things are going to come back. You're going to experience these shifts and these changes. And so it's not going to be like a full-blown harvest moon, full bright intensity all of the time. Sometimes it might be more of like a waning crescent 3. You know, something that is a little bit smaller. And, you know, maybe that is a reminder that like that trigger or that point in your life is going to go through those phases and those movements just like the moon will. And I think that's important to remember, you know, and I think that's why I like the Queen of the Moon Oracle for this, is it does give space for feelings can be persistent, right? And I think it's very important to dive into that, to seek the appropriate therapy, the appropriate medications, even if you need, the appropriate coping mechanisms, whatever works for you. So these are my 3 oracles that I use when I'm primarily feeling stressed. So like I said, when I start to feel that sense of overwhelm coming, that's kind of when I know that my practice needs to shift a little bit. So when I'm just experiencing the stress, I can receive kind of like this direct guidance of like this one keyword that I can hold on to during the day. But when I really hit that point of overwhelm, there's one deck that I use consistently, always, period. And it's going to be my surrender cards. So I think that these are one of the most magical tools that are in my collection. I think when it comes down to needing to take a breather, and you can hear it in my voice, there is no deck that best teaches me that than surrender. So when I'm at the point where I'm just stressed, I can handle pulling cards every single day. But when I'm at the point where I'm completely overwhelmed, at that point, my usual coping mechanisms have pretty much like fallen apart, and I'm not reading tarot to support myself every day like I usually do. And so the thing that is really powerful about these surrender cards is that these larger themes, such as surrender your ego, you can do a lot of like deep and heavy work with just one of these cards for an extended period of time. When I'm really overwhelmed, I can pull one of these cards, I can put it on the altar, and I can sit down and I can journal with it, or I can even take a picture of it and put it on my phone and save it as a background. And I know that like surrender your ego, like that's something that's going to take me multiple weeks, hell, even multiple months to learn. But it allows me to have this anchor point to where I really start to see my behavior and my experiences during that point of view from a particular framework. And I find that's the most beautiful thing about tarot that we can use to support our emotional health, is that it provides us that framework for us to analyze our actions. And through that framework, because we're able to take that step back and say, maybe I am going through this sense of overwhelm because I'm not open to receiving support and love. Hearing a card like this at the exact moment, pulling a card like this at the exact moment, can be really radically life-changing when you're overwhelmed. And at the end of the day, the message is right here. So this is an incredibly low energy practice. You pull one card, you sit on it for a week, and this is what I like to do when I'm feeling that sense of overwhelm. Now, I could also in this category say that I use a tarot deck in a similar capacity. So I have another one that I think I would use if I was feeling overwhelmed, and that would probably be my Crow Tarot. I say probably, but I feel like I have used this deck when I was overwhelmed earlier at the beginning of the year. I think that's why I did pick it when I wrote these notes. I'm sure I picked it for a reason. Might just be gut instinct that it would work. Might be that I tried this one in practice. I have definitely tried the surrender cards in practice when being overwhelmed. So the crows and I have a really lovely relationship. The crows love to yell at me until I listen. And I think if we look at the definition that Brené Brown actually provided for overwhelm, it says that you're experiencing extreme levels of stress to the point of not being able to function, and you're overcome by thought and feeling. I have this deck that doesn't give a shit. It actually doesn't give a fuck. Let me actually not even censor myself about if I'm overwhelmed by thought or feeling. This is a very heavy air deck. It's incredibly abrasive. And sometimes we need that kind of light and gentle message from the surrender cards. You know, the message is right here. We kind of have like this old school artwork. But other times when we're overwhelmed, instead of kind of wanting to be like soothed and comforted, but still given like really good direction, sometimes we want to be told, snap the fuck out of it. And I don't know if that's particularly the healthiest route for everyone's mental health, but I know for me, I sometimes need it. And the crows, they squawk at me and they complain to me, and they're very jarring towards me, and they tell me, Katie, you need to fucking listen. And sometimes that's what I need when I'm overwhelmed, because at that point I'm overcome by thoughts, I'm overcome by feelings, and I need something to just break the pattern. So in that case, that's where the Crow Tarot really functions for me in my sense of overwhelm. And I would love if y'all have decks that are kind of like the crows that like constantly squawk at you until you listen, and like decks that force you to confront patterns even when you don't want to pay attention to them. Like, let me know. I want to know. So that was the Crow Tarot paired with the Surrender cards. Depending on like what kind of mood I'm in that day is going to depend on where I go with it. You know, sometimes I want like these heavier messages that like I can sit with, but other times I want those crows to tell me what to do and what to do immediately, and I better listen. It has a different sense of approach. Both decks are kind of encouraging me to break from that pattern with kind of clear direction, but one is much more loud and the other one is definitely more gentle. And like I think that goes back to discretion, right? We have to pay attention to what we have left to give in terms of spiritual and emotional energy to determine what's best. So those were the two emotions that Brené Brown listed for when things get too much. I now want to dive into when things are uncertain. So in the case of Brené Brown's book, she categorizes anxiety as the larger feeling that we're experiencing, or rather the largest like state or trait that we're experiencing. And then underneath it, she has other keywords such as worry, avoid, excitement, dread, fear, and vulnerability. So all of those words are smaller categories that are underneath anxiety. So I do think it's important to note here too that according to Brené Brown, and of course according to the APA as well, anxiety can either be described as a trait or a state. So in terms of a trait, it is the case that some people are genetically predispositioned to anxiety. I know for sure that I am. And then other people are experiencing a state of anxiety based off of stressors that are in their life, or perhaps even biological factors such as like, I don't know, like high blood pressure or like high blood sugar or something like that that is causing that anxiety to be experienced. So in the case of Brené Brown, she claims that worry is the starting point of anxiety. So we're going to start there. So according to her, worry is a chain of negative events that might happen in the future. So we are acting in regards to our worry for things that are going to happen in the near future. So in the case of worry, when I'm feeling like I'm really worried, it's different than stress. Stress usually has to do with work or with finances. It's things that are external that are complicated, but I still have some sort of control over. I feel worry goes deeper than that in the sense of we don't have as much control, hence why this is classified as something we feel when things are uncertain. So there are two decks that I really tend to rely on when I'm experiencing that worry. This is the Jade Oracle. And then I also have the Illuminated deck of Holy Souls. I end up alternating between both of these decks. So I'm going to flip them both at once because I kind of use them for the same purpose. Both of these decks are oracle cards that I use on my altar. So when I'm experiencing a state of worry and I'm worried about things that might happen, I find that it helps me to identify a particular figure and really focus in on the lessons that I can learn from them. So I don't think that I practice necessarily deity work in the sense of like reverence or in a sense of traditional sense of what some people might do at their altar, but I really like to play with the concept of ideas and learn more about these individuals and these deities when I'm in that state of worry. So it does help me quite a bit to know that there's a sort of touchstone for me to come back to. So at the end of the day, I might be going through this sense of worry, but I can always touch back home and say, based off of what I've learned about Saint Francis, which is a deeply important figure in my life because my father was born somewhere that's kind of named after him. But what can I learn from Saint Francis himself, or even in that kind of concept like my father, since it has that tie to him? What can I learn from She of the Serpent Skirt? I do wish I knew how to pronounce that name. If anyone knows, please let me know. And to hold on to these figures as I go throughout my day gives me that sense of strength. It gives me that sense of a place to touch back to. And it just offers some sort of clarity in my life. I think that it's normal that when you worry, you want to look outside of yourself, because worry internalized becomes extreme anxiety. But when we're able to place those worries elsewhere, such as what I do with these figures at my altar, it does give me a sense of relief. Like, it's not that I think that these individuals, like these saints or these deities, have any say or are active participants in my life or what I do, though some totally might believe that, and I think that that's a 1000% valid thing to believe if that's aligned with your spiritual practice. But having them reminds me to step outside of myself. And I think that's what we need to do when we're worried. We need to step outside of ourselves and look to others. And like I had mentioned before, what the beautiful thing about the tarot community is that we do build a community, right? And in community, we're able to find that structure. So in times when I don't feel like I have necessarily a strong community around me, we do have tarot readers. This is a very like lively area in terms of spiritual commitments. But I mean, there aren't always events all the time. I still do live in a very deeply Catholic area. And so at the end of the day, like, it's not like there are that many networking activities for us. But it is nice to touch on this spiritual touchstone and know that there is a sense of community outside of myself. So I guess that's a really long way of saying, like, these figures, once I learn about them and I work with them for a while, they do feel like they become part of my community. So that's what I do when I'm experiencing worry, is I work with the Jade Oracle, which was this one, and the deck of Holy Souls, which is the other. So when we're experiencing anxiety, one of the first things we do is worry. Another response people have is to avoid. So essentially, we don't show up fully and we zigzag around what's bothering us. So I feel like avoidance is one of my middle names, especially in relation to relationships. But in relation to emotions, I think I do a pretty good job in like confronting those like head first. So I think that I most frequently use, for this particular instance, William Blake, as well as Zombie. And I use them a little bit differently, so I'm going to talk about them both here. So in the case of the Zombie Tarot, I think we need to recognize the Zombie Tarot is something that I use when I want to stop avoiding. Same with William Blake. So I think that this is my way of kind of like breaking outside of that pattern. Like, I'm tired of zigzagging around. Let me go ahead and like do this work. Because yes, I'm experiencing anxiety, but I want things to change. So in the case of the Zombie Tarot, as I've said before, it is a really excellent deck for showing power dynamics. And in a lot of cases, for me, a lot of my avoidance comes from like shifting kind of relationship dynamics and like social dynamics and things like that. And so I look to the Zombie Tarot to kind of point out to me exactly what's happening, right? This Page of Wands is perhaps really adventurous. They're chewing this bone, but like they are chewing a human bone. So like, yeah, like they're having fun and they're adventuring and they are like still young and youthful, but like ultimately they are doing pretty damaging things with their actions. And so I can read almost every single card in this deck from a shadowy perspective, and that helps me really see things on the nose. Like I've said before, either in this video or in other videos, I tend to be a very rosy person in the sense I see things from rose-colored glasses. So sometimes I need a deck to say, hey bitch, this is what's happening, or else I won't acknowledge it. And I just keep avoiding it and avoiding it and avoiding it because like emotionally I'm experiencing some stress, but logically, until this deck tells me, hey, there's a problem, you need to fix it, I'm not logically processing that there's a problem. And I think that like that's why it's so important to me to pick out some of my decks early. Like I have started picking them out for the month, but also to sit down at my table and meditate before I work with a deck, because I need to hear what deck is calling to me. Sometimes I don't know why I want to work with the Zombie Tarot until I sit down and I realize, oh shit, I've been avoiding this problem. And so when I start feeling the urge to bring out this deck, my intuition is telling me, you need to pay attention. Something's going on. And it needs to be fixed. So that is the Zombie Tarot in that case. Usually when I'm aware of the pattern with the Zombie Tarot, I will turn to my William Blake. This is a way that I use the deck that oftentimes I don't talk about on my channel. I think I use it a lot for creative work, like I've said before, but I oftentimes use this deck because it's incredibly, ridiculously confrontational. There's something about the artwork that really just speaks to me on a guttural level. And the keywords I do find for the most part tend to be pretty direct. And so I appreciate in its sense that if I pair William Blake with Zombie Tarot, Zombie Tarot might tell me what is happening, and then I'll pull from William Blake, and it essentially tells me kind of what to do about it in a very firm way. This is a very fiery deck, so this is a deck that kind of inspires me to get up, to act. It's a deck that makes me feel the spark within myself and say, I'm not going to get stuck in these ruts anymore. I really want to fucking do something about them. And it does, all the time. So I think she is a wonderful deck for purposes like this. I think technically any fiery deck, when you're avoiding something, can be a really good read. This is like the air deck that points it out. This is the fiery deck that says, so what are you going to do about it? And as someone who only has like 8% fire in her chart, I need a lot of fiery decks to tell me, so what are we going to do about it? So this was William Blake, and then the Zombie Tarot. So according to Brené Brown, another emotion we can experience during this time of anxiety is excitement. And I know that might seem like counterintuitive, but Brené Brown really talks a lot in her book about how different emotions, like we perceive different emotions to be different, not because we're experiencing them differently as a state, as a condition, but because we're taking cues from our social environment. So in actuality, anxiety and excitement can feel similarly, but we're looking to the social cues around us to determine if it really is one or if it's really the other. So one of the decks that helps me to sift through if things are anxiety or if things are excitement is going to be the Herbcrafter's Tarot. So I like to use this deck at the beginning of the school year, predominantly because it is a very Virgo deck to me, and the school year usually coincides with that, but also because this beginning of the school year is filled with so much excitement, but also anxiety. Like, I'm excited to meet these new kids, but I've heard that maybe perhaps like there might be some budget cuts, or I might have a new curriculum that's coming up, and I'm excited about it because it surely is probably better than the old curriculum, but at the end of the day, like, I'm nervous to make those changes. You know, I think that we can sit both in that simultaneous feeling of anxiety and excitement quite a bit. And this is the deck that I reach for that, because this is a deck that has that smooth, motherly, grandmotherly energy. I think when I am at that point, I look to the maternal figures that are in my life. I look to my grandmother. I do a lot of ancestor work with her when I'm coming up upon those big life decisions and interpreting, is it anxiety? Is it excitement? Is it both? And this deck really screams that grandmotherly energy. It's one of the few decks that I have in my collection that actually shows some age diversity. And so if you follow the hands, a lot of the hands that are depicted in this deck for the equivalent essentially of the king, they're older hands. And I like to see that reflected. I also like, other than the hands, that there are very few people, because we're calling on a grandmother energy that is deeper than humans, but it's more of like an earth-based grandmother energy, a Mother Gaia kind of energy in that kind of sense. And so it's a little nudge and it's a little reminder. So for example, 5 of Earth, which is 5 of Pentacles. I'm going to pull out the guidebook entry for this one. And this is a card that I never like to see come up, like, at all. But seeing this card, we pay attention to the fact that the slippery elm is endangered, but we are like putting together these protections in place to keep it upright. And like one of the quotes in the guidebook for this one is, even the wounded can heal. And I find that to be so beautiful in terms of grandmotherly energy, because it's like, okay, I am anxious about starting maybe this new path in my healing. Like, I'm about to do some really intense work at therapy. But at the end of the day, I do still have that sense of excitement. Even the wounded can heal. And so there's that sense of you're speaking to someone that is much older than you and much wiser than you. And by virtue of the fact that they have already lived such rich and full and vibrant lives, these cards are the ones that sing to you and tell you, you know, you don't have to be anxious. Like, everything will work out. Here's some wisdom that I've gathered as I've gone through life that can help you to see this as the exciting change that it is. It's the deck that can essentially turn a tower moment and meet it and say, hey, this is a tower moment, but what are you going to rebuild? So I can have that anxiety about that tower moment, but is what to come better? So Herbcrafters is my deck that I go to when I need that narrative shift. It's also one of the reasons that for this particular deck, I love this little bag as well. It like makes my husband laugh so much that it says weed bag, but it's all weeds. It's also one of the reasons that I only refer to that deck at very big moments of life, as well as like, I used to pull it like daily, but now I've switched to like big moments, as well as I only pull like 1 or 2 cards from it because the wisdom is so potent that I need to let it permeate. All right, and then we're going to touch on the one, you're probably going to sense my voice kind of like not as excited about this one. We're going to talk about dread. So in the case of dread, that is the high probability that things are going to happen that are negative, and you experience dread as the negative thing gets closer. So in the case of worry, like I'm worried about it, I'm nervous about it, it could happen. In the case of dread, it is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. So I have one and only deck that I use in those circumstances. Y'all probably know what it is. Leave a comment if you already guessed it. You know where I am and you know who I am. But I want to focus my intention on not just showing the deck and talking about it here, because this is Terra Botanical. I want to talk about a practice I do when I'm experiencing dread. And this is where I'm going to get very vulnerable very quickly. So while Herbcrafters is the deck that I use for, I want to embrace that grandmotherly energy and wisdom, Terra is the deck that I actually use to work with my ancestors. So I am going to say this as simply as possible. Let's see if I can. I think that if anyone is paying attention, there are a lot of things to dread right now. And I know that y'all are, because the tarot community is full of people that are widely intuitive and perceptive, and people that care and people that pay attention. And I think that there are things that can make us very validly feel dread right now. And so I was experiencing some dread in the last week or so. And my grandparents grew up in a situation very similar to what we are experiencing right now in the United States. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I think that's what I'm comfortable sharing in this video. But from a very young age, I heard stories of book banning, and I heard stories of propaganda. And I remember sitting around the kitchen table at 4 years old and talking to my grandmother, and her stories as someone who immigrated to the United States were the ones that brought me up. And so I think there's always been someone inside of me who is attunely and acutely aware of societal changes and like the geopolitical climate. And so the other day when I was feeling a very intense feeling of dread, I brought out this deck and I pulled from advice from ancestors, from my grandmother, my grandfather, and both sets of their parents. So essentially from 6 individuals. And knowing that all 6 of the individuals that I pulled from have gone through very difficult life circumstances, I decided to only pull one card from each. And the card was, what is your advice for me? Because at the point when I'm filled with dread and I feel like I'm on a carousel that won't stop turning and I don't know what to do, it's like I said before with the other decks, right? When I'm anxious, I tend to look beyond myself. I think that's what we all do within our spiritual practice. We look behind, like beyond. And I received like some really incredible messages. So my grandmother told me, like, Ace of Wands, go out there, fight, raise your voice, make content, and teach content that teaches people to stand up for what they believe in. My grandfather, always the practical man, told me, get to work, essentially 2 of Pentacles, make sure to maintain the balance. And he was definitely an ISTJ, so it totally fits if you know anything about Myers-Briggs. One of my grandmothers told me King of Pentacles, save money. My grandfather on one of my sides told me to leave. And that was actually a very spooky experience because I had pulled from a tarot reading 2 years prior and had recorded it, that he always felt like his life was limited because he didn't leave. He stayed in a circumstance he shouldn't have stayed in. And to pull both the Six of Swords as well as the 8 of Cups, it was a very clear message to go. And then I pulled for another grandfather, and he said King of Cups, which is my signifier, and then my other grandmother that said Hermit. And from both of them on that side, I really felt like between the Hermit and the King of Cups, it's a concept of my role in life right now is to serve. And my role in my life right now is to listen and to provide and to hold space and to make sure that the children in front of me are receiving the ability to critically think, but they also are managing well at this time. And so that was a deeply personal reading that I just kind of shared. I didn't even show you the cards for it. I guess I probably could have. But I think it's important that when we come back to dread, like if I'm talking about the practice overall, this is what I do. This is what works for me. I go to the people that have lived it already. And even guys, even for an inkling of a second, I'm not really communicating with them. I'm still remembering who they once were. And in the case of 2 of those people I mentioned out of the 6, I did know who they were. I did meet them. I did get to grow up with them. And it wraps you in this warm cocoon and gives you that sense of, I am receiving direction. This direction seems important because tarot is important. And now I know what to do next. And that I can manage when I'm feeling full of dread. But I know that I'm supposed to go out and, like the Virgo that is represented here in the Hermit, share that wisdom with my children and just be willing to do the spiritual work and to be able to pay attention to the spiritual work and to honor and be proud of my spiritual path. It makes life, a lot easier in the changing of the circumstances. And High Priestess, because my grandmother's name was Rosa, and this card actually came out when I was speaking to her last week. And she was a High Priestess, y'all. Every time I pull cards for my grandmother, I always get the High Priestess. It doesn't matter what deck it is. She knew a lot, but she kept a lot to herself. Okay, so thank y'all for holding space for that as I shared that. So I think the next one is one of the hardest. And I don't know necessarily if I would even go to tarot for this, but I think if I were to go to tarot for fear, I have an idea of what kind of questions I would ask and what deck I would use. So in particular, fear is long-lasting, high alert response to the present threat. And some people can experience it as a state, which means it's just happening in that moment to external stimuli, or as a trait, some people are naturally nervous and fearful people. So when I think about fear, we're talking about response to a present threat. Like I said, I don't know if I would grab my cards for that. I don't know exactly what I would do. I'm stuck in the dreadland. And what I had just said before, it really seems to kind of work for me. But I imagine if I were in a state of fear and I did have to pull out my cards, and this is speaking from a very hypothetical point of view, I could even say this is the deck I would bring out for other people. Maybe that's how I explored this emotion, is what deck would I use for other people who are scared? I think I would pull the Architect's Tarot. The reason being is because one of the most beautiful things about this deck is that the minors are panoramic. So let me actually show you an example of what that looks like. All right, so in terms of what I mean, this is the Four of Cups and this is the Five of Cups. And you can see even though the paths are different colors, they actually link up. I have a walkthrough of this in which I show that in case you're interested in seeing what that looks like throughout the deck. So I think it's important for me to work with this because if I am dealing with a client that is experiencing such fear, I think that it would be important for me to be able to tell where the fear is coming from. And the panoramic nature of this deck, I think, lends itself well to this. This feeling here in the Four of Cups is not having it happening in isolation. It's on the cusp. It's, you know, feeling that the Five of Cups is going to happen. And that's a different interpretation. We're not just pulling back, but like we're pulling back because we're trying to preserve ourselves from the decay and the Great Depression that is here in the Five of Cups. So if I happen to pull a longer reading for a client and there was that connection there, I would want to explore that. Because I think when you're working with fear, it's incredibly important that you honor what is in front of you. And fear comes from very valid reasons. And so it's a matter of, I can pull past, present, future, and I think that's great. But what are the cards themselves telling as part of their position in the tarot? You know, it takes on another level when you pull past, present, future, and then you not only consider what the card in front of you says, but the before and after of what that card is, you know, leading up to or coming from as well. It gives you more nuance and it gives you more room to really sit and have those long, deep conversations that you need to have with someone who is indeed fearful. I think I would also reach for this deck because it's an air deck. I find a lot of clarity from decks that are air decks. They're very cherished decks in my collection. And I think when we are sitting in this space, it's nice to have like these figures that are mostly like either like silhouettes or they're essentially outlines to indicate that anyone can sit within this space. This is a deck that essentially anyone can see themselves in this point of view in this Six of Cups. And it's important to give people perspective with that too. They deserve to see themselves reflected in the cards, and they deserve to see that they have a place within them. So maybe I perhaps copped out by talking about what I would do with a client. I think I would do the same thing for myself as well. You know, why am I scared? But in actuality, at that point, I would probably ask my husband to read for me. Because if I truly am fearful, I don't know if I'm going to be reading for myself in a way that is conducive, right? And I think that's my big disclaimer with all of these emotions is, you know, sometimes it's best to get readings from other people who are experienced. Sometimes it's better to not read at all because reading can sometimes reinforce anxious patterns. They definitely don't, in my mind, create them, but I think that they can reinforce them if we're coming to the table with that, right? Like tarot is a mirror into our real world. And so if we are coming to the table with that's what we're receiving as well. I think that's important. And then the last thing, so when we are feeling like things are uncertain, we can also feel very vulnerable. So we experience uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And I'm going to grab, I didn't even have a deck planned out from that because, I don't know, y'all have seen my notes. I didn't even have a deck planned for that, but I just came across one of them. So in terms of a message of vulnerability, I think in those cases I would use Terra of Light when I'm feeling vulnerable. And like not only because this is a loving and sweet and supportive deck and it's so gentle, right? Like it'll say what it needs to say, but it's here to meet you in that place of vulnerability with these soft figures, with this soft belt of love. But also because I consider this to be, like what I had put earlier, like this is a deck that kind of reminds me to keep my heart chakra open. And as someone who has some strong Cancer roots, I am a Cancer sun. I can either have my heart wide open or it can be slammed shut. I tend to door slam. I'm an ENFJ, but I do associate with like the typical INFJ, like door slams, if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs personalities. And I think when I'm feeling vulnerable, sometimes that vulnerability to me feels like an electric circuit. And every time I get closer to it, it just kind of stings me and it buzzes at me. And I want a deck that meets me in that space, that tells me it doesn't have to feel that way. Vulnerability doesn't have to be you getting hurt or you getting shocked. Vulnerability can be you reaching with other people and connecting with them, such as this Nine of Angels. This is actually the Nine of Swords, and like it says Guardian. So it is a very light wash deck, I will admit. But like maybe I don't need to stay up all night worrying about these situations, feeling that sense of insomnia from them. Maybe I just do need to reach out to that friend that's there and to keep that vulnerable heart. I could speak a long time about vulnerability. I think I actually did in my Tarot When the Heart is Open video, which is part of this. But vulnerability is one of my core values. My therapist asked us to identify like my core values so he could help me like design my life in alignment with that. And my first one was commitment, my second one was vulnerability, and my last one was connection. So I think that this deck definitely indicates and describes that connection and vulnerability. All right, this was a long video. I don't even know if I'm going to edit it. I think I'm going to keep it here. But I do want to go ahead and reinforce, and I'm going to say this. Please do not feel any sense of shame. Please don't spiral if you're at a place right now where reaching for the cards is not the best approach for you. I know that, like I said, with fear, I don't know if I would read for myself if I was afraid. And I think when times are really uncertain and when times really are too much, we're consuming data faster than what we can process them. And tarot is a tool that helps us to process, but tarot can also be a tool that provides us with information overload. And so if you're in a position where you say, you know, I am experiencing these emotions, but this is not something that I can do, you know, I think it's important to be gentle with yourself and to know that tarot will always be back for you and be here for you for when you need it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. I really appreciate y'all so much. Thank you for what you do, and I look forward to seeing you next time.